now we are going to move into a panel session that I'm really excited about. And I'm going to invite Sharon to pin as I introduce the folks who are joining us for this session around the changing needs of younger contemplatives. And so we have with us today Heather Roos, who is a wisdom spiritual director and a centering prayer facilitator. And here we go, Sharon. I know where she is, so I'm going to add her. She's a centering prayer facilitator. She's a student of Cynthia Bourgeot, who, as many of you may be aware, it is and was a student of Father Thomas Keating. And Heather is just a delight and a friend, and I'm excited that she's here with us. We also are inviting to this panel Mark Dannenfelser. Mark, where are ya? Do you see Mark? Oh, he raised his hand. Thanks, Mark. Okay, that helps. Okay, so we're bringing Mark into the conversation. Mark is on staff for contemplative outreach, but he also is a mindfulness practitioner and founded a mindfulness practice in Atlanta, Georgia, where he is. And a lot of his work focuses around trauma and trauma-informed approaches to mindfulness. And then we have Keith. Sharon, can you add Keith to add spotlight to Keith? And we're going to spend the next 25 minutes at the most, just in conversation with each other around what we are calling the changing needs of younger contemplatives. Because one of the things that the Centering Prayer guidelines and vision also says and acknowledges is that we at Contemplative Outreach are an evolving community with an expanding vision and deepening practice of centering prayer that serves the changing needs of Christian contemplatives. And so some of those needs, I think, directly are important for our generation of contemplatives. In the 80s and 90s, when Father Thomas was in the early years of founding Contemplative Outreach and sharing the practice, in psychology and spirituality circles, we weren't talking about somatic approaches to psychology or embodied spiritual practice. We also weren't talking in psychology about trauma informed or trauma based. And so we're acknowledging that now as we are engaging in our own contemplative practice and sharing contemplative practice with others as leaders in our various communities, we want to make sure that we are aware and have some information that might help us in facilitating groups. So I wanted to start with Mark and just hear a little bit from you, Mark, about I guess the importance of understanding trauma and why having a trauma-informed perspective can help us as facilitators of centering prayer and in our centering prayer groups.
Sure. I'm happy to be here, Colleen. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for all of you being here. It's very exciting, this turnout and the work that you're doing. So glad to do it, even though I'm doing it from the road. So I hope there's not too much background noise here. But one of the reasons why we brought in trauma into this discussion today is that partly because of the prevalence of trauma, the rates of trauma are very high in our culture. 90% of the population has been exposed to some kind of traumatic event. That doesn't mean you're traumatized for the rest of your life, but certainly some percentage of that, some estimates are 20% of us end up traumatized to the point where we show signs of PTSD. So that's a high rate. It's even higher in some communities. Women are twice as likely to experience high levels of trauma. Younger people, we're finding, are experiencing more trauma. And this is in the US because I looked at the American Psychiatric Association, some of the stuff they put out, but US Latinos have higher rates of trauma. US African Americans have higher rates, and Native Americans are disproportionately affected with higher rates of trauma. So it's a big issue. So the point is that when you're leading groups and facilitating groups, there are going to be people in your groups who are affected by trauma to a significant state. That doesn't mean you can deal with all of that, and nor do you need to feel like you need to be an expert on that, but just to be aware. And there are some ways that you can adapt and use language that shows support for people who may be struggling with trauma. And one thing that we know is when people come to meditative and contemplative traditions and practices, sometimes it's not a good experience because of that history of trauma. And so we need to find ways to support. That might happen more individually with people that you're working with, but you can certainly have an environment, a group environment that supports people who might be exposed to trauma. So I can say more about those adaptations as we get into the conversation, but that's really kind of the rationale for it. I'll just end this little opening with a quote from a trauma specialist, Pat Ogden, who wrote, "Any experience that is stressful enough to leave us feeling helpless, frightened, overwhelmed, or profoundly unsafe is considered trauma. From witnessing or experiencing violence, to losing a loved one, to being targeted by oppression, people can experience trauma in a variety of ways."
Thank you, Mark. And yes, I would like to come back to some of those adaptations for the practice. I want to invite you, Heather, to maybe continue this conversation and also talk about the relationship between the body and contemplative prayer, and how we might want to be conscious of how we approach centering prayer. And there's so much conversation about embodied practice. Can you share more with us from your experience?
Absolutely. And I too am grateful to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and it's wonderful to see all of your faces who've joined. And what I would say is, in general, and I know this is not necessarily the same for everybody, but in general, our contemplative practice has not really included the body. Our relationship with God has not necessarily included our incarnation. And coming from a Christian tradition, of course, open to all other traditions, Christianity is about incarnation, being in this body, right? Occupying this body. And so all of our contemplative practices ought to bring us more fully into our body, not less into our body. And so when we're practicing centering prayer, which is such a practice of deep surrender, consenting to God's presence and action within, that only happens here in our bodies. And so it's not a mental thing, and it's not just an emotional thing, but we don't want to just sit down and close our eyes and perhaps dissociate, which might feel kind of nice, but isn't this practice of deep surrender and centering. And so bringing that awareness of our bodies in the moment, sensing our feet on the ground, sensing our bodies in our chairs, and even sometimes becoming aware of what the sensation of release is like, can be really helpful in the practice of centering prayer, because whenever we're caught in a thought, which of course we know includes emotions and sensations, and we return to our sacred word, you don't necessarily need to be aware of this in the centering prayer practice, but there's going to be some kind of a release. There's going to be some kind of a sensation inwardly where your body is unclenching, right? It's yielding. And I'd say the other piece about being in our bodies, oftentimes I find for myself going into a centering prayer period, doing some kind of gesture of letting go. You know, to me, this is a big one. I'm opening. And if I can sense into that, there's almost something that can happen immediately that surpasses my mind saying, let go, you know, or open. And so being in the body and inviting gestures can be a huge part of coming more fully into the present moment and being willing to open ourselves fully to the divine. And of course, as Mark mentioned, uncomfortable things are going to arise in centering prayer. And so with that deep release does often come troubling content, right? Troubling thoughts, troubling emotions, troubling sensations sometimes. And so even just having an awareness, if that does arise and starts to become too much in the middle of a centering prayer sit, to be able to open your eyes, to lower the intensity of whatever that experience is, sense your feet on the ground. Those are all ways of also being able to be present to the uncomfortable things that can come up, and then to be able to just know that the body often, you know, the body often understands spiritual truths and realities that the mind has a hard time grasping. So sometimes just paying attention to what your body is doing, and listening to that wisdom as part of your spiritual path, and what God might be inviting you into outside of the practice of centering prayer is really important. So I'll just stop there for now.
Thanks, Heather. That, Mark, maybe this is a good time for you to talk a little bit more too about some of those adaptations.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I thank you, Heather. One of the things about trauma is that it's a kind of a fracture. The system is overwhelmed, the nervous system, and then it has trouble kind of resetting. And so what you were talking about, Heather, about the surrender part, for some people who are very activated, you know, coming from a trauma kind of background or experience, surrendering can be threatening. You know, as Keith said earlier in his presentation, this is a very it's kind of advanced level of practice, in the sense that, you know, we're doing some hardcore stuff here, dismantling the ego and the false self. That's kind of serious reconstruction, you know. So for some people who don't feel quite grounded, that's why the beauty of having you highlighting the body, you know, is really key, because if it's a lot about this kind of fracturing or detachment even, or disintegration, the road back from trauma is integration, or what we would say in centering prayer circles and in spiritual circles, we would talk about union with God, and union with others, and union within ourselves. And so when that's really disrupted, sometimes just being aware of that. So Heather, you already mentioned an adaptation that I'm very much in support of with regard to the centering prayer guidelines. And remember, those are guidelines, emphasis on guide, where they guide properly is the way to go. And so giving people choice, especially people with trauma experience, giving them choice. And one is to keep your eyes open. You can close your eyes, or you can open your eyes, or you can open them at certain times. You know, you don't have to be perfectly still you can adjust even within the practice. The other thing is posture, and Heather, I think you were going there. We're talking about the body. The body gets expressed, trauma gets expressed in the body, and so that's a key area. So, yeah, you can do centering prayer standing up or walking. Sometimes on retreats we walk, and for some it's thought of as a kind of a break from the practice, but it really is part of the practice. You know, that you continue centering, you continue presenting to God as you walk, but you're moving. And for some people, that's enormously grounding and just being able to move the body. So that guideline, I'm really looking at guideline 2 here. It says, close your eyes and sit still or sit, you know. But of course, that's just a guideline. And then the other one I would say is the 20 minutes. You don't have to do 20 minutes. Now, if you're in a group, you have a set time and people know that coming in, you know. But when you're working with people individually or when they're going in between group times on their own, you can use language that gives kind of permission in a sense to adapt the time that you're practicing if it's too much. And there's that kind of dissociative thing that Heather was talking about. So I think, you know, the main thing is giving people choice, and highlighting that these are guidelines is very helpful.
Thanks, Mark. And Keith, I want to bring you into the conversation here because what I hear us talking about really is being inclusive, and in the way that we teach the practice, the method, and the way that we respond to people's experiences with the practice. But also another thing that I know you and I have talked about, Keith, is inclusivity around language, especially when we're in interfaith contexts. But also if it's just, you know, a bunch of Christians in the room, inclusivity around the way we talk about God, talk about one another. Just want to hear your perspective here and offer what you can to us about holding inclusive space.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Colleen and Mark and Heather. That's amazing. Yeah, I think a big piece of what I think about with this is sort of like the history even of centering prayer as a practice that was brought to us out of the Christian monasteries, out of American Christian monasteries, by 3 white men, and how that gets given into the world. And so some of the history of contemplative outreach is it's a part of the Catholic Church in a lot of ways. That centering prayer is this rich tradition that's captured in the contemplative tradition of the Catholic Christian Church. And there is something very valuable and something very much worth celebrating there. And then centering prayer got into the Catholic churches, and then somehow in 2010, an evangelical in Western New York, myself, found centering prayer. And a lot of people these days, I know younger people in particular, are either hearing about it on YouTube or sometimes on Instagram, sometimes just a friend that recommends a book. And so I think the way that traditionally centering prayer has been handed down through the Catholic Church in a sense is a good way. And yet it's not the same way that maybe millennials or Gen X or Gen Z is finding out about the practice. And so I want to lift the fact that it is a Christian contemplative practice, and there's something worth celebrating there, because so much of our cultural has shifted towards like yogic practices or mindfulness, which is more traditionally Buddhist in one sense. And so there's like a real, that's part of the picture of society. And so I think what this practice has to offer is some roots inside of a tradition that's often overlooked, the Christian contemplative tradition, the Christian mystical tradition. And yet at the same time, one of my favorite things to say to make it really explicit is that just because mindfulness is born out of Buddhism in a lot of ways. But you don't have to be Buddhist to practice mindfulness. Yoga is born out of Hinduism. You don't have to be Hindu to practice yoga. And centering prayer is born out of Christianity, but you don't have to be a Christian to practice. What you need to practice is the willingness to consent to the divine presence and action within. And so anybody can do that as long as you're comfortable with those words in one sense. And so, yeah, honoring the Christian tradition and yet transcending it to say, well, everybody's invited. Just like everybody's invited to be mindful here, be here now. Everybody's invited to that. Everybody's invited into the body. Everybody's invited into consent. And so you don't have to be a Christian to practice, but at the same time, so many of our resources that we bring are Christian books. We have God the Father, 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 Father. We have a lot of he, him. I love Thomas Merton, for example. Love Merton, but if I bring a Merton reading to a group, he's saying the word he, him every other word. And so what we can do as leaders is just subtly transition those words. Replace God with the divine. Replace he with she. Replace she with God. Replace God the Father with God the Mother, and then vice versa. If you go too far in one direction, take your group in another direction, just as a way of being really inclusive, just widening the pool. And that also means widening the pool of even readings that we bring, because it's very easy to bring Thomas Keating readings or Joyce Rupp or any number of Christian leaders that fit our tradition, and that's wonderful. And at the same time, there's enormous resources when it comes to the readings. Are we bringing only white Christians from America? What about people of color? What about Asian? What about people outside of the US? What about... So that's what I would point to, is how to update both our language and how to be inclusive in an inner spiritual context, because so many of us are finding Thomas Keating on YouTube, and then we find Cynthia Bourgeault, and then you find Muji or Rupert Spira or somebody, anybody, it could be any, Thich Nhat Hanh, and all of a sudden, are they saying the same thing? Are they not? You know, so how do we bring everybody in under the same umbrella without losing the distinguishing factors within them, within the traditions? So I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Thanks, Keith. So good, so important. And you and Heather in particular, because you send out regular emails to your list, and just in my experience with you, Keith, when we were on retreat with the Mystic Fire, I think that's what we named it, but the well of readings and resources you and Heather have, it just amazes me. I get your newsletter, Heather, and I'm like, she never watches TV, you guys. She can't, because she's just has so many references. Heather, anything you want to bring back into this conversation from listening? And then I want to invite a couple of questions in the chat. And if we have time, we can respond. So if you're listening and you have a question, please put it in the chat. I can't promise to answer all of them, but I might pick one or two. Heather.
Yeah, I just want to say, as Keith was talking about this coming out of the Christian path, you know, every path focuses on the body at some point, and that too is in our Christian path. And you know, over time, people have drawn on sacred gestures, body prayers, all of these different, listening to the wisdom of the body. You know, our walk of faith, whatever that is, our relationship with the divine, whatever that is, only happens in our whole being, right? Which is our mind, which is our emotional climate, which is our body, which in the Christian tradition, all that together is often considered the heart, the way of the heart, which is really that massive deconstruction that Mark was talking about that happens. Our body can be a huge resource to come back to. It can also be unsafe, and so or our experience of it can also be unsafe. So that kind of thing can come up, but there's always a way of being able to find somewhere in the body that is at ease, or somewhere in the body that is comfortable. I guess the other thing I would say about that is that our body is always in the now, right? And so it's a way of coming back, and it's and our body, I think, really does understand surrender and consent, and we're listening to that. You know, as Mark was saying, centering prayer doesn't necessarily have to be done sitting down. You know, there's something about that movement that our body begins to understand, and I know this is not a popular word, but maybe like, well, yield to something beyond ourselves. So I'll just say that for now.
Yeah, could I add to that too, just on the language piece too, because there's definitely being familiar with other traditions, Keith, as you were saying, you know, and then Heather, your point about being familiar with the body is a kind of language too that we don't always use. We don't speak that, you know, especially in some of the traditions. We're very centering prayer is one of them. You know, I used to think it was just all in my head, you know, because it's like, what am I doing with my mind? Am I consenting? And, you know, but the other thing I wanted to say about language is the language of science, which Thomas Keating was very interested in, his kind of the whole thing about the human condition, and his language, the psychology language that he was using. And this is one of the things that I've discovered just working with trauma, is that there's been a real upgrade there in the language that we could afford to be familiar with, you know, when we talk about trauma or other kinds of aspects of the human condition. So there's that too, the language of science, which sometimes we put over here because we consider it not spiritual or something. But really it belongs in this process, because if we are transforming and we are consenting and we are turning our lives over, that's every part of our life, and that the inner experience of us is part of that. And for trauma, that's especially true, as you have been saying, Heather, you know, that Bessel van der Kolk, who's a trauma specialist, says that until trauma victims become familiar with and befriend the sensations in their bodies, physical self-awareness is the first step in releasing the tyranny of the past. So until they really engage that way, and centering prayer can assist that. And by the way, we're not saying you should be experts in trauma or in every other spiritual tradition or in the Christian contemplative tradition, you know, and know the history and everything, but it's helpful to be just familiar and know that it's out there.
Yes, absolutely. We just want to be well-informed centering prayer group facilitators, not experts. I see questions. I think the one question I would choose to invite any one of you to respond to is Charles's question. Dean, that's a great question, but Dean, you know, that's a whole session and not a question. So we'll have to add that to the agenda for our next gathering. And Jane, yes, the welcoming prayer. I think that's another aspect of bringing how you can structure your group, right? So like Bob mentioned, you can also use Lectio. You can also use the welcoming prayer, you know, in our group. So absolutely. And that the welcoming prayer was a response to these earlier concerns about what to do with the unconscious matter that arises in our practice. So this question, Charles's question, what does thinking of nothing look like? Heather, we were just talking about this on the podcast. Maybe let me let Heather respond to that.
Well, one of the misconceptions about centering prayer is that you're supposed to stop thinking or think of nothing. When, we have two different kinds of practices. One kind of practice is all about letting go, surrender. That's what centering prayer is. Welcome practice would be more about attention and putting your attention on something, presencing something, that kind of thing. So in centering prayer, it's not that you're trying to think of no thing. It's actually you're building the muscle of letting go. So anytime a thought, you actually need the material of the unconscious to build that muscle, right? You need thoughts happening so that you can let them go. You need emotions coming so that you can let them go, or at least not be caught in them. And so you return to your sacred word. You're not thinking of your sacred word. It just acts as that vessel of letting go, and trains into your brain and everything, this ability to let go and just let all of that. You're not rejecting anything. You're not, pushing anything away, but you're also not clinging onto it either. And so as soon as we can make friends with the idea that we don't have to stop thinking, I think that makes a really big difference in our centering prayer practice.
Thank you, Heather. And thank you, everyone. I want to hear all of your responses to that question, but we're definitely out of time. We could have a whole day with us. Maybe we should, as another facilitator offering. So I'm so grateful to call all of you friends, and I want to make sure that everyone here knows where they can find you. So we'll put your websites in the chat. And also, a plug, Mark and I co-host the Opening Minds, Opening Hearts podcast of Contemplative Outreach. And Heather and Keith will be guests on this second season. So you can hear more from them too on the podcast in conversation with Mark and I. So thank you so much for being here. Especially Mark, on the way to the beach. Enjoy your vacation. And Heather, we'll talk soon. Thank you so much.